Ever since his November election win, President-elect Donald Trump has been laying the groundwork for major changes in American foreign policy, in some cases sending signals that could turn foes into friends and friends into foes. On Russia, Trump has expressed a desire to work closer with the Kremlin than Barack Obama did during his 2 terms, after the U.S. intelligence community, including the CIA, declared that Russia tried to swing the election. Trump and his aides pushed back.
I think he would accept the conclusion if these intelligence professionals would get together, put out a report, show the American people that they're actually on the same page.
On Israel, Trump signaled a reversal of Obama's support for a Palestinian state. Trump's pick for U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, supports the legalization of settlements and Israel annexing the West Bank. Friedman has also questioned the need for a Palestinian state and says he expects to work from a U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, a city still claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians as their rightful capital.
A Trump administration will never pressure Israel into a 2-state solution or any other solution that is against the wishes of the Israeli people.
And earlier this month, Trump took a new position on U.S. policy towards China, talking with the leader of Taiwan by phone, breaking with decades of precedent, saying the U.S. is not bound by the One China policy, a mainstay of Sino-U.S. relations, and tweeting that China stole a U.S. naval drone, then telling Beijing to keep it. Concern is mounting in Beijing, particularly over Trump's stance on Taiwan.
Adhering to the One China principle is the political foundation for the development of China-U.S. relations.
China is not the only country paying close attention. Of course, Iran is watching closely to see if President-elect Donald Trump will upend the Iranian nuclear deal, and Cuba is also on guard to see if Trump reverses the historic normalization of diplomatic relations with the United States.
Switzerland and Germany, and it is only getting worse. The civilized world must change thinking. Matt, what does that mean?
Well, look, I think a couple things are at play here. If you look at, say, for example, what happened in Russia, I mean, that is between Russia and Turkey.
You mean in Ankara, where the Russian ambassador was assassinated?
Right. So it's not exactly clear what Donald Trump would do to prevent something like that. But if you're talking overall about the international situation that we face, and I would lump in the battle against ISIS with Russia, with China, with the sort of geopolitical situation that Donald Trump is about to inherit, I do think that he's going to sort of have a Reagan model of peace through strength. And I do think it's true that President Obama has basically allowed a vacuum and allowed a situation where internationally a lot of things have gotten out of control, whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's China. I think drawing the red line invited some of this stuff. In Syria. And I do think that it's possible that Donald Trump will take over and send a signal that, you know, this is no longer going to be tolerated.
So, Clarissa, let's get your take. You're in Moscow right now, and of course, the government there shares the perspective of our president-elect here that just call all of this the same thing. It's all terror, it's all Islamic jihadi terror, and it is weakness to say otherwise. Don't burden this with complexity. But in covering the issue the way you have, what do you see as the best way forward?
Well, Chris, let me just say that we've actually had a response from the Kremlin to President-elect Donald Trump's tweet that you mentioned. Dmitry Peskov, who's a spokesperson for Putin, wrote, Trump's statement echoes what Putin has been saying for the past 16 or 17 years about the need for a joint fight against this common threat. No single country can fight it on their own. In terms of your larger question about the best way to tackle it, I don't think anybody exactly knows, because there isn't a sort of one-size-fits-all answer to eradicating terrorism. And the 3 examples that President-elect Trump gave, one example was in Zurich, where 3 Muslims were shot in a mosque. One is a situation in Turkey between Russia and Turkey based on the atrocities playing out in Aleppo that, frankly, could any one of a number of millions of Muslims who feel horrified by the atrocities that they have seen taking place in Aleppo. That does not necessarily fall into the rubric in a classical sense of a sort of ISIS or militant attack. And then you have, of course, the attack that we saw in Germany. Horrifying again, deadly again, difficult to solve again, but none of these three attacks really fall into the same category. So it becomes very difficult, I think, to talk about just taking a blunt instrument to the entire situation or to the entire problem. The Russians have gone with the sort of theory of Tacitus, right? I have created a desert and named it peace. The idea being that you bomb it into submission, you bomb it until there's nothing left except for peace. Well, that may work in Chechnya and it may yet work in Syria, but there are repercussions for those kinds of actions, as we saw in Ankara, Chris.
Abby, Mr. Trump did not mention Yemen, where a suicide bomber killed 50 people, but is it overly ambitious, overly optimistic to think that there is a way to stop 4 disparate attacks, Turkey, Yemen, Switzerland, Germany, 4 individuals? This seems like a very tall order.
Well, it's worth noting also in Trump's statements that he called out terror attacks against Christians, but didn't mention that several of the attacks that we saw yesterday were brought out against Muslims, and that Muslims are in fact some of the greatest victims of terrorism around the world. That went unsaid in his statement, and also Trump, I think, is signaling that these attacks, no matter what their motives or even who they were going against, are going to fall into a category of things that help him make the case against ISIS, things that help him align himself more closely with countries like Russia, who he believes is fighting terrorism in a way that he wants the United States to emulate. What that means what that could potentially mean for U.S. foreign policy is that while there's a lot of concern about how Russia and Syria and Iran are prosecuting a war in Aleppo against, in many cases, civilians and NGO workers, there's concern about that, but Trump has not expressed any concern about that at all. And in fact, he's put more of a premium on this idea of fighting terrorism, no matter how you do it.
Right. Well, but that's it can achieve the same goal, though, right? The president-elect has decided to keep it simple, right? Clarissa has been covering this in a very different way. She understands the complexity of it. It informs her journalism. So seeing it in the context of a Roman historian, Tacitus makes sense. For president-elect, he is not burdened by that kind of complexity. So for him, he sees all these things as the same thing, bad guys doing bad things. Is that the right approach for the United States?
Well, look, I think your last guest actually nailed something about the big trend. If you're looking, again, these are 3 disparate attacks or more. It's hard to sort of have a cohesive, what would a president do?
Game plan against these 4, right?
Right. They're very different, but I do think that there is a common thread. And Peter Beinart has written about this at The Atlantic, and I think he nailed it. America, that I grew up in, sort of the Ronald Reagan America, the dominant paradigm was the forces of freedom versus the forces of tyranny. I believe we are now entering into an era that will basically be Christendom, or Western civilization, call it what you want, versus radical Islam. I think that is the new paradigm that Donald Trump sees the world in, at least for now.
Is it religious war?
Well, I would say it this way. If the paradigm is versus tyranny, then Vladimir Putin's on the wrong side. If the defining, fight of our time is between the forces of Christendom and Western civilization versus radical Islam, now all of a sudden Vladimir Putin is an ally in that struggle. And that seems
not a big embracer of Christianity, by the way.
Well, ostensibly, obviously he's a former KGB agent, was part of the Soviet Union, who were atheists, but he is sort of hearkening back to the church and trying to create this basically a war, and it's not create, this war exists between radical Islam and the forces of Western civilization. Now this, I think it's a crazy sort of alliance because I'm not a big Putin fan, but the argument here is that radical Islam poses an existential threat, and just as America teamed up with Joseph Stalin to defeat Nazism, Donald Trump will now team up with Putin.
Big announcement thus far today. President-elect Donald Trump has selected Georgia Congressman Tom Price to be his Health and Human Services Secretary. Price has been a vocal opponent of Obamacare since it passed in 2010. So does this mean the undoing of the health care law? Doug Schoen, former advisor to President Bill Clinton, Fox News contributor, and Brad Blakeman, former deputy assistant to President George W. Bush. Gentlemen, good day to both of you.
Good morning.
I know Doug is a Democrat. You okay with this pick?
Well, I'm okay with the pick in terms of qualifications. I'm more worried about what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act. I understand it'll be repealed, probably should be repealed, but what is going to come in its place? I know we have tax credits on one hand, private subsidies or public subsidies of insurance purchase for private individuals, as well as getting down the line greater coverage for the high-risk uninsured and indeed competition across state lines. All good ideas. How is it going to work to make sure we don't lose the essence of what Obamacare tried to do? Expand coverage and hold down costs.
I want to make sure I heard you correctly. It should be repealed. You're saying that. Right?
I've been saying that for many years. It's not worked. I say that as a bipartisan Democrat, but the principles it embodied, I feel very strongly need to be included.
Brad, he took Tom Price for a reason. What do you think of the pick on his face?
I think the Price is right for this job on numerous levels. He's a doctor. He's a legislator. And he knows the law inside and out. He was the victim of it passing as a congressperson. He knows the law probably better than anybody on the Hill. And I believe he's probably the only person who's probably read the bill in its entirety and understands its complications. So repeal and replace, perfect. I think my prediction is that Secretary Price will be one of the most consequential secretaries of a Trump administration.
Wow.
Because the most important job is repealing and replacing Obamacare, also dealing with entitlements, Medicare and Medicaid. So in addition to keeping our country safe, we've got to keep our country healthy.
Orthopedic surgeon before I went to Congress. Few of the ideas, and apparently this was proposed about a year ago, something the president clearly rejected. Among the proposed cuts would be Medicaid expansion, middle-class subsidies for private policies, tax penalties for refusing coverage. Doug, does that fit with what you just talked about?
It does, but I'm concerned that Medicaid expansion is something that may be necessary. I'm concerned that subsidies that the middle class need might disappear. But that being said, let me be clear. Obamacare is not working. The principles behind it, holding down cost and expanding coverage, are ones we've got to maintain. I hope the Price appointment and the legislation that follows accomplishes that goal, keeps pre-existing conditions and as includable in 26-year-olds up to 26.
Apparently, both of those provisions are in that.
Which is very good.
26 and under stays, and pre-existing conditions stay as well. Just want to read from FoxNews.com, Brad, get you to react. Price said Republicans want to address the real cost drivers of health care spikes, which are heavy regulatory burden, taxes, and lawsuits against medical professionals. I think as a baseline, you can probably start there.
Absolutely. And that was the problem with Obamacare. They jammed it through. And like Pelosi said, we have to pass it before we read it. Nobody read it. Bill, the 3,000-page bill, by incorporation by reference, is about another 30,000 pages. It was written by lobbyists and cobbled together. Nobody understood it. And it is probably one of the most unbelievable failures of legislation and leadership of a president in modern history. And Trump's going to reverse that. Look, we need a market-based system that is fair and equitable for all.
It's not going to be easy. I think we can all agree to that. Brad, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Doug, thanks to you as well.
Thank you.
Great.